Hello there, Linux users. On any Linux system, whether it's a server or a workstation, there are different types of users. By default, there's always the root user, the administrator of the system. That's spelled R-O-O-T. If I open a terminal, Ctrl-Alt-T, or simply find it in the menu, there is a user called root. If I go to that directory, so cd/ list of files and folders, you'll see there is a directory called root. That's the directory or the home directory of the system administrator. Now, if we close it and open a terminal for ourselves, you'll see we have a different directory for our files, which is the /home/ your username, in this case Ubuntu. Different type of users. Each user can have their own home directory. For root, that is the /root directory. For regular users, it's in the /home directory. Now, users, there are different type of users. So you can have a standard user. A standard user, and let's say we click add here, you can have a standard user. A standard user can use the Linux system, but they cannot do things that an administrator can. For example, they cannot install software, uninstall software, or do all kind of system configurations. An administrator can do anything on the system, including deleting every file on the complete system. So they can make the system completely unusable. That's why you never want to use Linux as a root user, because if you make one mistake as a beginner, it can completely break your system. And so in general, a good practice to be a standard user. And then if you need to be administrator, there's a command called sudo. Now, in order to use that, you need to be an administrator user, but still by default, you will be a standard user. So to get the administrator rights, you need to type sudo in front of your commands. And so that's the basic idea. There are two types of accounts, standard user and administrator. Standard is really standard, just use the system and that's it. Administrator can install software, delete software, do all kind of like advanced things with the system. You'll see here that a user by default on Linux systems is protected by just a password and that's it. So only a single password, and that's all they need to access all your files. Which in the time that Linux came out, around the 90s, it was fine. There was not really so much of that hacking stuff going on. These days, okay, just a password, it might not be enough to secure your system. You might want to add things on top of that. Even with a password, I mean, even if you're not a hacker, they might be able to guess your passwords simply by trying some commonly used passwords. So a password might not be enough to secure your Linux system. However, at the time that Linux came out, it was a really, really long time ago, and password was enough at the time. Now these days, there's additional things you can do. Here, if we want to add a user, let's say we add some user, and we set a password, it automatically tells you like the security of your system. So this is in this graphical interface. So let's say you pick a really bad password and you'll see, okay, they give some recommendation as well. It needs to be longer, add more letters, numbers, punctuation. So they give some tips to pick a secure password. So it's of course possible to pick some secure password. You might think that's nonsense, but I'll show you that picking a simple password might actually make your computer very vulnerable, and if you're using a Linux computer. So it's a good practice to really secure passwords, and in this terminal they give some recommendations, but also if we try it in the terminal itself, so if we say password for the user, let's say we pick some passwords, you'll see that what can happen is that they recommend picking a password that's longer, or that is too short or too simple, and so on. So basically the same thing, but in the terminal. So like this, they can say in the terminal the password is shorter than 8 characters. So that's what is considered a bad password, because that's very easy for a hacker to crack. So it's important to pick good passwords, and a good password, it might not always be obvious. So why do you need all these special characters and so on? Is because hackers often use lists, so a list of commonly used passwords, for example, a list of 1 million passwords, and then they automatically try every password in that list on your computer. That's why you want to pick passwords that are not commonly used words from perhaps movies, books, authors, actors, music, and so on. Because what happens is that those are probably in a commonly used password list. So if I go to Google, for example, I type password list, you can find, for example, a list of 10 million passwords. So those are commonly used passwords. Now on Wikipedia, you can find 10,000 most common passwords. And there's some shorter ones. You'll see here a list of 40 million passwords, and you can simply download those password lists. So if you go to such websites, you can simply download. So you see here download button for this one. They share those password lists online of commonly used passwords. So if you have a password like that, really bad idea, because a hacker will try those passwords in the list one by one automatically. So they're not typing it, but they just use a program for that until they find the right passwords and they're inside your computer. So passwords, even in a Linux system, they are very important. But of course, it's not the only way to secure a user account anymore. I'll see you in the next video. Hello and welcome back. Let's say we want to share some things on the network. So for example, we go to the settings menu and we can click go to sharing. You'll see we can share our desktop, for example, say remote desktop. Maybe we want a legacy protocol, remote control. And let's say some password that we pick. And so we close this one. And we want remote login as well. So using SSH, you can remotely get a terminal. Now, to verify that or not be on Ubuntu, so what we can do is we check sudo service SSH status, and you'll see it's running. Now I did everything using the graphical interface. Let's say you want to do everything in the terminal. You can, for example, install the remote secure shell using the command sudo. So with this package, OpenSSH-server, and this is simply the installation for your package manager. So for Ubuntu or Debian, you can use this command. If you use another Linux command, just use the command for your Linux system. The package is called OpenSSH-server. You'll see it's already installed. So if you run this command and you see that it's running, you can press Q to quit. It means someone can remotely log in to your computer. For example, you might have your work computer where you want to be remotely log in, or maybe a computer in another room. And then you can use SSH for that, which simply allows you to connect to your own computer. Okay, so let's say this is another computer, and you can remotely log in. So we type SSH, our username is Ubuntu, and then our network address. Now, we're not going to cover a lot of IP networking here. It's not a networking course, but we can simply type localhost, which means this computer. In a real world scenario, you would type the network address of your computer. So what does this do? This command SSH username at the destination. It allows you to remotely log in. So we can type the password, and now we can remotely use the Ubuntu computer. For example, you can be on Windows or a Mac or on another Linux system. And then we can remotely log in and use the system to type all kinds of commands. So it's similar to remote desktop SSH, but it's just terminal version only command line, but basically think of it like remote desktop. Now, okay, we can share all those things on a network. Is it a good idea? Well, let's see. On the right, we have another Linux system. You'll see Kali here, it's Kali Linux, often used by computer hackers to hack into systems. You can get it for free from kali.org. Basically just a Linux system, except that all the tools included are all kind of hacking tools. So you'll see here Nmap and other subtopics, password attacks, wireless attacks, reverse engineering, and all kind of things that hackers often do. And so it's all good and well. So let's see how is the security of this box. It just shares some things on the network. Let's see if we can get in. So I'm gonna open a new terminal here. Now we can enlarge this screen for clarity, and we're gonna look at it from the hacker's perspective. So we had Ubuntu Linux, thinking we're secure, picking some simple passwords. Now let's take a look from the hacker's perspective. Okay, so as I said, we will need a word list. So we can find a word list in the directory user share word list or on the internet. I'm going to get it from user share word lists, which is simply a list of passwords. So 1.4 million password lists. You'll see here rocku, txt, gz. I'm gonna copy that to the home directory, paste it, and now extract here. Now this only takes a second, and if we refresh the home directory, you'll see we have a list of commonly used passwords, 133 megabytes. And if I show you that file, you'll see commonly used passwords. So first 1 2 3 4 5 6, 1 2 3 4 5, 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 passwords, I love you, princess, and so on. And if we go through this list, you'll see commonly used passwords that people have used in the past, 1.4 million commonly used passwords. It's a small password list, 1.4 million. And a hacker will not type all of these automatically, manually. Will not start typing them one by one. That would take ages. So what they'll do is use an automated tool for that, trying every password one by one. So before all of that, I mean, of course, they need a password list. They need to know who's on the network. So let's do a quick scan. So they use this command to scan who is on the network. You see, almost instantly we got two different computers. You'll see locally administrated one, and here's another one. So probably it's this one. Next, what they will do is scan the computer. Maybe there are some apps running, so they want to scan that. So they type the command nmap with the IP address, with the network address or the address of the computer. And they'll find that, okay, there is some things open on that computer, some sort of ports. You can think of them like doors into the computer. There is the remote shell or the remote command line, SSH, running. They also find remote desktop running and something else. Now that's great because they can try to log in. For example, they can say SSH, maybe the user is Ubuntu, add that computer address. You'll see that's the address we just scanned, the same computer address. Yes, and now they need a password. So what they can do is try those passwords that before one by one. So simply going through that list. So let's say they have that password list, and then they can go 1 2 3 4 5 6, 1 2 3 4 5, and so on, going one by one through that list. Now manually that would take ages because there's 1.4 million passwords. So they can use an automated tool for that. One of them is Medusa, another one is Hydra. Let's use Hydra. I type Hydra. You'll see this is the command to use, Hydra. Now we're gonna assume the user is Ubuntu. Then after we type the username with -L flag or -L parameter, we do use a capital P, so uppercase, with the same password list. Then the target network address and also the app we want to target, so in this case SSH. And if we run it, you'll see it's trying the passwords one by one. And then we found the password, which in this case was monkey. We can then use that to log in because we now know the username and password by simply trying the brute force method, which means trying every password in that list automatically. In this case, it went really fast. It depends on the password. So there's 1.4 million passwords. There's a high chance that the password is in there, but it might be that it's the 500 million passwords and not one of the first. This is just for demo purpose. So now they can log in. They have the username, password. And you'll see now there's user Ubuntu. So they can remotely control this computer. They can remotely modify anything now. So in any you can modify files, delete files, and basically mess around with your whole system. So if we go to the desktop directory here, you'll see there's a new file created that the hacker did. And we can delete files. You see the file has now been deleted. They can really mess around with the whole computer system if they have SSH actions or remote desktop. If they get in, and all they need to get in is those some network sharing enabled, and a bad password. And that's all a hacker will need to get into your system. So it's very important to secure your user accounts. And one of the key things is to pick a good password. And a good password is not a commonly used word. Be some word with a year or anything basically in those internet lists. Now, those lists can be really huge. Like I showed you, this one is 1.4 million, but you can have password lists of 10 million or even larger. So you really want to use a password that is as random as possible in order to prevent this kind of attacks. Hello and welcome back, Linux users. Now, you might know that Linux stores users and passwords in files. These files are in the etc directory. So if I browse to the etc directory, so let's first go to the / directory, you'll see an etc directory where Linux stores all of its configuration files. If you scroll down in that list, you'll find there is a file called passwd, which, unlike the name implies, it doesn't actually store passwords, it just stores some user information. So if I double click on it, you'll see a lot of different information about users and system users. So enlarge this a bit. So you can find, for example, the user root, and that's using the directory /root, which you learn about in the first video. And you'll see they use the shell bin bash, so the terminal environment. You'll also see a lot of users which have a username, but they don't have any login ability. They says user has been no login, so they are system users. You can't actually log in as a system user. It simply exists. So this is an actual user because we see bin bash, so they can log in. Now if you scroll down this list, they have a lot of system users in Linux systems. If we scroll down, you'll see actual users. For example, we have the user Ubuntu, and they have the directory /home/Ubuntu, and they have a login ability because there's /bin/bash. So any user that has /bin/bash, they can log in to the Linux computer. Anything else like /bin/false or /user has been no login, those are users that cannot log in. They are system users. So how can you filter that from this list? Well, let's open a new terminal, and we know that file is /etc password. So we could simply output it with the cat command, cat, and that shows the whole list, all of the contents. Now we know that Linux users, they want to log into the computer, otherwise it's just a system user. So we can filter that. So to filter that, we type pipe, grep, and then we can type bin bash. So we're going to filter on the word bin bash. So now we see the users that can log in. So we see the user root and the user Ubuntu. So using this command, you can find out, let me clear the screen and make it more clear. So using this command, you can find out the actual users on your system. Now that's very useful because a lot of hackers, if they get access to your system, what they will do is add some new users to keep access into your computer. And so it's always a good idea to check out which users exist on your system. They might use alternative shells, so bin bash is one possible shell. They might use something called Z shell or fish shell, some alternative. But anyway, you can filter on those as well. So for example, maybe they're using Z shell, so you would filter like this. Now in this system, nobody's using Z shell, but you can figure it out using those filters. So you can say, for example, /bin. You can find the users, and you'll see all of these are like not login. So for general purposes, most people use the bash shell, so this would list the actual users on the system. Now there's another important file. So if we go back to the file explorer, there's another file. You'll notice that once we looked into this, where are the passwords, right? There is no password stored in these files. Now let's scroll down, and you'll see there's a file called shadow, and that file, if we click on it, we can't open it. Why? That file contains the passwords. Passwords are not human readable. So let's say we want to list those passwords. We need administrator access, so we need to be able to run sudo command. Now the file is called etc shadow. If we list that file, you'll see that users that can log in, for example Ubuntu, and the user root, they have this big line of text. So that is actually how the password is stored. It's stored in that unreadable text called a hash. Now, a hash is easy to make if you know the input, but if you know the hash, it's very hard to go back. So it's very hard to find out what is the password if you have this hash. So if a hacker has access to this file, etc shadow, they would have to crack the hash. They can't just see this and, oh, that's the password. I mean, nobody would be able to read the password from this. They would need to crack the hash, and the same for the other user. They would need to crack the hash in order to get the password, the original password, and they would need to have a bit of luck with it as well. So that's how passwords are stored and where users are stored. So this file, shadow file, is where the actual passwords are, and it should be unreadable by users by default. So we are the user Ubuntu, and in this, as this user, we shouldn't be able to list that file or output that file because it contains the passwords. So then if someone would get access to this account, they wouldn't be able to, they wouldn't know the password because it's like an unreadable file. So they would need to be administrator in order to be able to start cracking the passwords. As a regular user, it should be unable to read etc shadow file because it contains the passwords. Did you know you can lock users? So what does it mean, a locked user? If a user is locked, they can no longer log in a traditional way. So when the computer starts, they can no longer log in. So you can lock a user and unlock a user. How do you do that? With the passwd command. So you might be familiar with the passwd command for changing passwords, but you can also use it to lock users. So you can type sudo passwd -l for lock, and then the username, for example, root. And now, if you were to try to log in as root, that's no longer possible because the account is now locked. So you can only do sudo to run commands as administrator, but you can no longer directly log in as the user root. So if you type passwd --help, you'll see also all the flags, and one of them is lock. So the user is then locked, it can no longer log in the traditional way. To unlock it, you use the -u flag. So sudo passwd -u root will unlock it, and they can then again log in as the user root. So you can do this for any user, it's not specific to root, and then you can prevent users from logging in. So quite a neat feature, and it can be a security strategy to disable the root user so that nobody with physical access to the computer can directly log in as root. They have to log in as a user and then use the sudo command. So that's one possible security setup you could do. Completely optional, of course, but that's how you would lock a user account. So this unlocks it, -u, and to lock it, -l. And you type sudo in front because you want to run this command as administrator. So passwd, the command, is not just for changing the password, but also for locking accounts and unlocking accounts. Hi there, Linux users, and welcome back. So it's all about security of user accounts. Now yourself, you probably set good passwords. You know that you have to have long passwords that are uncommon because otherwise a hacker might use password lists to get into your accounts. But what about other users in the system? You can't really talk to everyone. Well, you could, but a better way is to set a password policy. So setting certain rules for passwords. You can do that by installing a package called lippam pwquality. So this is the package name inside Debian and Ubuntu. You see I have already installed it, so that's for Debian and Ubuntu. If you use Red Hat based system, you would type something like sudo yum install lippwquality. So you'll see the package name would be slightly different on Red Hat based like Fedora or OS and so on. So you'll see it's installed. This is for Ubuntu and Debian, which you see I'm on the Ubuntu box. You can set all of the password rules that new users must comply with. New users must have those password rules, and you can configure them in the file etc security pwquality.conf. So quite a long name there. You can open it with any text editor. Make sure you're administrator so you can change configuration files. So pwquality.conf, so this is the file you want to edit. And in there you can set rules for passwords. For example, you can configure the minimum length with min length, set minimum class, so the minimum number of classes. So what is a class? So you might know that some of these fields, especially on the web, they ask you uppercase, lowercase, digits, symbols, and whatnot. So if you want, you can set that. And also, for example, reject username, so don't have a username inside the password. So how do you enable such a rule? Because by default, you'll see everything is blue here inside this config file. Let's say we want to enable a minimum length of 8. We would remove those comments. So those two, that dial sign in front turns it into a comment. So you want to remove that. If you want to enable it, so you can do that for any rule. Let's go through this rule: min class, maximum repetitions. You can find all kind of rules here. Checking whether the words are in the crack-lip dictionary. Probably a good idea, right? If a hacker will use that. So you want to enable that. Checking if it's containing the username in some form. So you can enable that, and so on. You get the idea. You can configure your own password policy, and of course how you configure it depends on your own reasons. So you can save it, Ctrl O, we can quit, Ctrl X. So now we have updated the password policy here. So let's say we want to edit again. Simply open the file again, and let's say minimum length of 10 characters. Save it, close, and let's say we want to now change the password. So sudo password for the user Ubuntu. Let's say we pick some short password, and you'll see now the password length must be minimally 10 characters long. So it's using the password policy as set. Now, of course, if you want to go really fanatic, you could increase this length. For example, the password length must be minimal 30 characters long. I mean, you can make it as secure as you want. And now if we try to set the password, you'll see minimum password is shorter than 30 characters. Now, of course, a human would be having some struggles to remember a 30 character password, but you can set your passwords in that file, depending on how you want the password rules to be. And that's how you can enforce other people to use better passwords. Hello and welcome back. You'll see here that we have a regular user. If I type who am I, it shows I'm Frank. And with the Frank user, I can do commands. I can run commands as administrator as root by typing sudo in front. For example, you'll see when I type sudo in front, now it tells me that I'm root, so it run it as administrator. Now we can do any commands, of course. It's a potential security risk. So if you're a regular user and you can do sudo, it is a possible security risk, because it means if someone gets access to your accounts, they can also do administrator commands. So they can become root or get higher permissions in your system. So what you can do for regular users is to remove them from the sudo group. That means that you can do all your stuff, web browsing, or whatever you're doing with your computer, but you can no longer run commands as administrator in that specific account. So you would have to log out and log in with an administrator account. Really good security practice. Of course, it would be a little convenient. How do you do that? So first, we're going to open a new here. You'll see I am the Ubuntu user. And what we'll do is we'll remove Frank from the sudo group. So how do you do that? You can type the command sudo pass g pass wd. So remember, here's a g in front instead of pass wd, g pass wd, minus d, and then type your username, so in this case Frank, and then remove the sudo group. So you'll see it removed Frank from the sudo group. Then if we log out Frank, and then we log in as Frank again, so now we are Frank in the system. Let's try to do the sudo commands, and you'll see Frank is not in the sudoers files, so cannot run administrator commands anymore from the Frank account. Now alternatively, you can do this with the graphical interface. So if you go to the settings interface in Ubuntu, so it will not work on every Linux system, but some Linux systems, they have in the settings a user overview where they can configure. For example, Frank in this case is not administrator, meaning part of the sudo group, and you can pull the switch and it will be again in the sudo group. So you can do it with the graphical interface as well, but regardless of Linux distribution, you can always do it in the command line. So just by typing this command, Frank has been removed from the sudo group. Now let's say you want to add a user to the sudo group. So we removed Frank from the sudo group, but let's say we want Frank to be part of the sudo group. Then you type this command. And now Frank is again part of the sudo group. So you can add or remove groups from a user, and specific group that we're interested in is the sudo group because it gives administrator rights to a user. So you can remove that for security reasons. It's an extra layer of security that you can do on your Linux system. If you add it to the user to the sudo group, it's more convenient. You can quickly do all kind of administrator commands, but keep in mind it's also a security risk, because then if a hacker gains access to your account, they can then also do those sudo commands. So that's it for this video.